Now, hopefully you've already got this book because, again, this will be the book that we're using for the next part of the class. All right, it's called JavaScript 6th edition. And boy, this is really, really slow and I don't know why. So I'm going to try to see if I can close a few things. Well, once this eventually comes up, I wanted to show you what we're going to be going through in the book, but rather than doing that, because I don't want to waste any more time than we've already wasted, what I'd like you to do is, if you would, grab your copy of the last program that we worked on, which was that payroll iteration 1. And again, yours may or may not have the code in it. Whether it does or not, just open that up. And then do a file save as, and save it as, you know, the same name it has, except instead of iteration 1, call it iteration 2. So in other words, I would take this, I would do a file save as, and I would change that 1 right there to a 2. I've already done it, so I'm not going to do it again. All right. So what we're going to do now, and again, I'm just introducing this stuff to you, and my hope is that when we get to the point where we go through it and you have to know it, you're tested on it, etc., that you'd be, oh yeah, that, I remember that. All right. Now, there's a whole concept that you may or may not have ever heard of before, and I'm just going to put this couple words here up on the overhead. And that is the whole concept of what's known as, okay, try it again, structured programming, because that's a lot of what you'll learn in here. And it consists of sequence, selection, and iteration. And iteration is also known as looping or repetition. I read a book once, and I found what they said in their SAD, and share that with you. And they said, sequence is when you just do everything. You know, you've got 10 things to do. You do number 1, then you do number 2, then you do number 3, then you do number 4. When you reach number 10 and you finished it, you're done. And they likened it to like an old guy, maybe an old widower, who gets up every morning and does the same 3 or 4 things, and that's his day. Kind of sad. Maybe you've seen that commercial on TV, one of the ones for, I think it's the NFL Network, with Peyton Manning on it, and he's in a park in his pajamas and his bathrobe, and he sees an older gentleman in there, and the guy tells him, work as long as you can. Well, with sequence, you don't deviate. So if you're the kind of person, you get up every morning, you go into the bathroom and you do what you have to do in there. You leave there, you go into the kitchen, you make your breakfast, you eat your breakfast, you do that, you get your books, you get your keys, and you come here, and you do that exactly the same. Those 5, 6, 10 steps, that's sequence. That's not how most people live their lives. I don't know about you, but I typically find out that especially on a weekend, if I say, okay, this is what I'm going to do today, and I plan out, I might even write it down, maybe a half dozen things, usually something happens, and if I'm lucky, I do 1 or 2 of them. All right, because like as they say, life just gets in the way. Well, the reason I'm telling you that is when you work with selection, you've looked a little bit at that, all right, but we haven't really done anything at all with it. That's going to be using if statements, if-else statements, and something that's called the switch statement. And you're going to see those as we go on, all right? And the best way I can tell you is, everybody has done this before. that you're driving down a road. It can be a highway, it doesn't matter, but you drive down a road and all of a sudden it goes like this. The road that you're on ends, and you can either go left or you can go right. But the way it is, you have to go one way. We're assuming you can't back up. You know, it's some kind of road where you can't back up. All right? This is like selection because you ask a question here, and if the answer is yes, you go down one route. If the answer is no, you go down another route. All right? That's what we're going to look at in just a minute. The last thing that's in there, iteration, that allows you to repeat something over and over and over again. So imagine that instead of 10 of you in here, I had, you know, it was at a university, maybe I had 500 of you. All right? If I wanted to go, and if I'm grading your stuff by hand now, just for a lot of various reasons, but let's assume it was all automated. I wouldn't want to run a program and have to type that kind of stuff in there 500 times. You know, that if you get 90 or above, it's an A. If you get 80 or above, it's a B, etc. That I wouldn't want to do that. I'd want to write it once, put it into a routine, and call that routine or loop through that routine 500 times. That's iteration. All right? And so what you're going to learn with iteration is there's three kinds of loops that are available in this language. There's the while loop, there's the for loop, and there's the do while loop. You're going to learn about all those. All right? I don't know if this ever came back up again or not. No, it didn't. That's really interesting. There. All right. So the book itself has 12 chapters in it. Notice it's kind of neat because on the first page, these are the 8 chapters that we're going to go over. All right. The way that Evan has this set up, I have promised him that the first year that I teach here, I'm not going to change anything. I'm not going to deviate from what he does unless it doesn't make any sense to me. And he liked that. But he wants to talk to me during the break, and he wants to find out in this class what worked and what didn't work. He wants to talk to me at the end of next semester, and we'll do the same kind of thing. The reason I'm telling you that is he has said, hey, I tried going through all 12 chapters, and students just felt so deluged. There was so much work for them to do, it just didn't work. So he said, I'll be happy if you get through the first 8. Well, the good news is that gives you a lot of really good Java fundamentals, so that's good news. The first chapter, we're going to be able to buzz through that fairly quickly because you're getting a lot of that stuff right now in the introduction to JavaScript. Then in chapter 2, we talk about functions. All right, you're already going to see a little bit of that today. In chapter 3, it says building arrays and controlling flow. Well, guess what control flow is? That's that selection and that iteration. So you'll see that stuff in there. Part 4, debugging and error handling. I showed you a little bit of that yesterday if you remember when we hit the F12 key and your screen split, so you're going to learn a little bit about that. Chapter 5 is probably the hardest chapter in the book, or at least amongst the hardest chapters. It's on the document object model. In chapter 6, you're going to learn how to validate forms using JavaScript. In chapter 7, one of the things I'd mentioned to you previously was the fact that JavaScript is an object-based language, which means that it's got object-oriented capabilities, but you don't have to use them, except in chapter 7. In that chapter, you'll have to learn object-oriented JavaScript. And then in chapter 8, it's strings and more array stuff than what we just looked at. All right. Oh, I guess I go this way now. This is the stuff that we're not going to have time to go through. Chapter 9 is on security. Chapter 10 is on mobile devices. Chapter 11 is on AJAX. And chapter 12 is on jQuery. You'll notice that the appendices, Appendix B, working with HTML and CSS, that should all be review for you. Appendix C, JavaScript reference, all right? Something you may want to take a look at, all right? They have little quizzes at the end of the chapter, and they actually give you the answers to them, all right? But again, we're more concerned with in here, if I get you through the first 8 chapters, Evan's happy, so I'm happy. All right. So, in the first example that we looked at, again, we hard-coded everything in. Where is that? So every time you ran it, it came up with these results. In other words, the name was the same, first name, last name, hours worked, and pay rate were the same. And since you're multiplying the pay rate by the hours worked to get the gross pay was the same. So there was no deviation at all. In the second one, we added some. We gave you the ability to go in there and do that. In other words, to go in and put in a first name, put in a last name, put in a pay rate, put in an hours worked. Okay? What we're going to do in this next example, so I'm going to close this, close this, close this, and close this, is now what we want to do is talk a little bit about an if statement. Now this, I tried to use verbiage so that hopefully it would make sense to you, but in English what this is saying is, did the employee work more than 40 hours? If the employee worked more than 40 hours, she or he has overtime coming to them. Does that make sense? So in other words, if I work 40 hours a week and I make $10 an hour, I get no overtime and I made $400. But if I work 50 hours in the week and I make $10 an hour, then what I make is for my first 40 hours, I make straight time. But for my other one, so I have to take the 50 minus 40, which is going to be 10 hours, and then I multiply that by my pay rate times my overtime rate. All right, and what ends up happening when I do that is instead of 50 times 10, which would be 500, I get 40 or 400 plus 150. So I'm making $50 in overtime pay. Does that make sense to everybody? I use examples like this because it's something that people can relate to. I worked a job when I was 16, when I worked at that food store. When you worked over 40 hours a week, you did get time and a half. All right? So if you look at the code here, this literally is saying, if the number of hours per week you make is greater than 40, and then I put a comment there, you have overtime coming. Your regular hours are 40. Okay? Your overtime hours are your hours worked minus max non-OT, which is 40, or I could have said there minus your regular hours. So I tried to really lay this out so you could figure out what was going on. So again, if I put 50 in there for hours worked, my regular hours is 40, my overtime hours is 50 minus 40, or 10. And then I'm doing the same exact calculation right there. All right? So if what's in here, and I may have mentioned this before, we may have talked about this even yesterday, that's a Boolean condition. All right, the program can look at the number of hours worked that's put in there for input and can determine by looking at it whether it's greater than 40 or not greater than 40. If I work 40 hours or less than 40, I get no overtime. If I even work 40 and a half hours, then that half an hour becomes overtime pay. All right? And when we did this, just so you see this, this is, I don't know, I'm going to say interesting. You may or may not agree. See how the word const there? See that? See how it's in blue? Because it's recognized as being a keyword. The problem is JavaScript, again, we mentioned yesterday, JavaScript is under the control of the ECMA, the European Computer Manufacturing Association. So what they did was they said you could have that const keyword and you could use it like a constant. The problem is even if it's a const, you can still change its value, which you shouldn't be able to do with a const. Older browsers don't even recognize the word const. They only recognize the word var. All right? So what I'm telling you is these are constants and you should never change them. But JavaScript does not stop you from changing them. That's really stupid. Yes, it is. All right? So same variables here that we had before. None of those have changed. Those are the same 5 variables. But I added 4 more. I added a variable called reg hours for regular hours. That's the number of non-overtime hours you work. So if you work 30 hours in the week, that's your regular hours. All right? If you work anything over 40, then 40 is your regular hours. All right? If you work anything under 40, you have no overtime or OT hours. If you work anything over 40, you have OT hours. This, again, that's the most number of hours you can work without getting any overtime. and this is the overtime rate. And I'm asking this question, all right? If you look up on the screen here, does it make sense to people why you use constants? If somebody were to determine later that, you know what, when somebody gets, has overtime coming, instead of paying them time and a half, we're going to pay them double time. Then all I have to do is change that to a 2, recompile the program, and now everybody gets double time instead of time and a half. But I only have to change it in one place, all right? So if I'm using that OT rate, maybe this is a really complex program that's thousands of lines long, and I'm using OT rate in there time after time after time. Okay, I only have to change it in one place and recompile the program. That's why you use constants. All right. The other thing that constants do is they make your program, all right, at least a little bit more self-documenting. All right, but to say OT rate in there might be easier for people to look at and understand than time and a half or 1.5. So, and there are people, believe it or not, I don't think you're in, none, any of you are them, but there are people that look at this and don't realize that that means time and a half. They just don't. Or that it means 150%. They just don't realize that. All right? So this stuff is exactly the same as what we had before. So what's changed in here, is we added these 5 variables, and then we're going to put in our if check. And then the output is exactly the same. So what I wanted to show you from this, all right, and I guess I did pull that code out of there, so I've got to bring up the HTML file. All right, and that's good. I didn't realize I even had this here, so I'm going to show it to you this way. All right, put in your first name, put in your last name, put in the number of hours you worked, put in your hourly rate, and you notice it's 550, so you can see the calculation worked. All right? Now, like I said, just doing this was an accident, but it's going to work out well, because this is what I want to show you. All right? Notice here, I grabbed that script tag, and I put the script tag right up into my head section. You can put JavaScript script tags anywhere. You can put them in the head, or you can put them in the body. Some books will tell you always, always, always put them in the head. Other books will tell you always, always, always put them in the body. So you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, if you put these in the head like I did, all right, then they don't load until everything before them has loaded into memory. Does what I just said make sense? The stuff loads into memory in order, okay? So if I've got this in here, and there's some code in it that's going to manipulate this stuff, that code may try to fire before that stuff has been loaded into memory. But if I take these two things, these 2 lines, and I move them from here down to right before my body tag, my ending body tag, then since all the head loads before the body loads, all right, that's why some books say, oh no, all this stuff should always be down at the bottom of your body. Then you're sure the entire web page is loaded into memory. All right? But we're not doing anything big here. There's just a button in here. That's it. But what I want you to understand is if you look, you've seen stuff like what's in gray before, the first line. Input type equals submit. Value equal run program. That's just, so you should know what this means, this line in gray, or yellow, I guess, and you should know what that line means. What this line means is when you click the button, go over into this file and find a function or a routine named main and run it. All right? So what we're doing is we're putting what's called an on-click handler in there. That may or may not make any sense. And it's not that bad if it doesn't make sense right now. But in the next few weeks, as we transition over from HTML to JavaScript, you're going to be writing stuff like this. So it's going to be important that you understand it. So again, this whole thing in here, lines 7, 8, and 9, are creating a button. All right. The button says on it, run program. There it is. So all that stuff that you see, the button That created it. That put the name on it. This says when you click it, that's the routine you want to run. And if there is no routine by that name, so for instance, notice that the name of the routine is main. I'm just going to type mains there. I'm purposely putting in an error. So I'm going to type mains. And now I'm going to come back and try to run this again. This still looks the same. And notice when I click it, now nothing happens because it's trying to call a routine that does not exist. All right? Sometimes when you do this, just so you know, I might click it like that and it might run anyway. And it might look, it's like you changed the name. Why did it run? Because it's working with an old copy in the browser. So if that ever happens, if you make changes to a file and you go and run the program again in your browser and it doesn't look any different, click the reload button, the arrow button right there. And that should reload a fresh copy in. All right? You might never have that where that happens, or you might have it where it happens. So I've got to either go back and change this from mains to main, or I have to go back into here and put a S there. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, again, it might sound really simplistic, but it's amazing the types of errors that you'll make. It just is. All right. You can use brackets for JavaScript as well. So if you like using brackets, you can continue to do that. All right, again, I like the color codedness that I get here and when I'm showing you stuff, and that's why I'm going to continue to use Notepad++. All right, but is there anything that's in there as far as adding these new variables or as far as putting this in that doesn't make sense to people? Because I'm trying to go over logic with you. All right? All right, if it does, then what I'd like you to do is bring up, like I said, bring up that past program, and I don't care if it's all, for right now, you're not turning this in, so if it's all in the same file, that's fine. If you want to put it in a separate file, that's also fine. But I'd like you to go back to that second program we did yesterday, save it as another name, and then go back in and make these changes. So start by making these changes that are in gray. So add those things. I want everybody to get this program working. I want everybody to get a program working where we're going to do a simple loop. And then by the time we get into JavaScript, you know what internal JavaScript looks like. In other words, JavaScript that's written inside of your HTML. You know what external JavaScript looks like. You know what sequence is. You've quickly looked at selection with an if statement, and you will have looked at one type of loop. All right? Yes?
Do you want this in our JavaScript folder, or JavaScript file?
The one that we were working on yesterday, we did 2 of them. Open up that second one, save it as iteration 2 or whatever, and then start putting this stuff in there. I don't care if you do it in the HTML or if you pull it out and put it in a separate file. You're not turning this in. I'm more concerned right now that everybody successfully does some JavaScript and does the sequence, which you've already done, does the selection, and does an iteration. Because I want to get right into the coding. Chapter 1, which explains all this stuff, we're going to bop through that quickly because you'll have already had all of that. We'll do this today. We're going to go through a couple examples of this, and then what I'll have to do tonight is to go online and look at the next homework and your midterm, and hopefully I can get it so where tomorrow I can give you your next homework. All right? Then you'll be able to work on that all day tomorrow. We'll take the test Friday because Amin said so, and after we take the test, the rest of the period will be lab. Plus, you'll have some lab time next week to work on it. All right? think last time we called this hours worked, which was HRS, and this one was pay rate, but you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Because people will say to me, does mine have to look exactly like yours? No, and you're not turning it in. But when you start to create your own programs, you are going to come up with your own variable names and names for your own functions, etc. Now, before we go on, if you'd all look up on the screen here, see that at the top where it says function main? In some programming languages, you need to have a function that's called main because that's where the program always starts. Next semester in the C# class, you're going to have a main. All right? A year from next semester in the Java class, you're going to have a main. JavaScript does not have to have a main. You could call this hello and the program would work just fine. If I called it hello right here, then I'd have to change it to hello right there. But there's nothing significant in JavaScript about the word main. All right? And really, in any language, the word main is not a key word. Notice how the word function is in blue. That is a key word in this language. Main is usually used. And believe it or not, one of the reasons that I asked you to put the tag in on the test where you put main in there was so you started getting used to the word main. All right? And I think that's one of the reasons that they use it and put it in as a new HTML5 tag is it's used in many, many, many programming languages. Main is typically, all right, right now we've got all of our code in this routine. It's all in the main routine. But usually that's not what main is. Main is usually what's referred to as a driver. I may have even mentioned this to you already. All right, and a driver is like a supervisor. All right. I remember years ago when I got into teaching, one of my older brothers, who is he's a supervisor for Harley Davidson, and he said, "Man, I wish I had your job." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you get 3 months off in the summer. You don't have to do anything." And I said, "I wish I had your job." And he said, "Why is that?" I said, "Because you're a supervisor and you never have to do anything." All right, you might guess that he took a little bit of offense to that. All right, when we were kids, we used to always, well, he beat the hell out of me because he was bigger than me. All right, but main should be like a supervisor. Your most successful supervisors, it's not that they don't do anything, but they know how to delegate. So if there's 5 jobs that have to be done, they know the 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 different people who would do those jobs best, and they delegate the authority to those people. The reason I'm telling you that is what we'll move to eventually, if you look up on the screen here, is you'll have main someplace. And rather than main doing all the work, and you say, "Oh, it's still doing it." No, it's not. Main is now calling routines. It calls input first name, then input last name, then input hours worked, then input hourly rate, then calculate gross pay. So it calls routines that are very short routines for the most part. Then it says, "Do you want to run the program again?" And if you do, it's going to run it again. Otherwise, it's going to stop. That's what main is supposed to do in virtually any programming language. So again, rather than doing any processing in main, main should be a driver, and that's what a driver is. I've heard people give analogies, and they say that main is kind of like a conductor for an orchestra. The conductor typically doesn't play an instrument, but she or he sits up there with the baton, tells people louder, softer, when to come in, when to back off, etc. They're a delegator, all right? And that's what we're doing now. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to put in those 5 lines. So now you move down, and after your prompt statements, come in and put in this, please. I'll let everybody put in everything up till the word else, then I'll move it down again. I've said this before, those of you who type slowly, learn to type faster. All right? We're going to finish this, then we're going to take another break. After we take the break, we're going to look at one more of these. So you're going to save this one as like iteration 3, and then we're going to make some more changes to it. Yeah. What's that?
I have a question for this is the one I see the elevation from for this upgrade, right? So this isn't supposed to be the first elevation. I was putting all this stuff in this, right? I was supposed to put this in.
You're going to be adding those 5 variables, but other than that, everything up till the if statement is exactly the same, other than those 5 variables.
Right.
Right.
So just keep
comments at the top and stuff, that doesn't matter.
Okay, so I just put that on the.
That's fine, you can put it in there, but you don't need to.
Okay, so I just put this in the JavaScript stuff, and then to link it over here, is it just,
Is that in a JS file or not?
this is all the stuff that I've done.
Okay, then what you're gonna need to do is to go back to the corresponding HTML file and put a script tag in. And you'll say script, and then you'll say source equals, and you put the name of that file in double quotes, and the script tag, and then put an ending script tag in. So in other words, you're gonna do this. So if any of you put this into a separate file, if you put it into your own .js file, then you need to go back into the HTML file and put in script, source equals, whoops, src equals, let's just say you called it javas.js or something like that, /script. That's how you bring in external JavaScript files. If it's internal, of course, it's already in there, so you don't have to do that. Now, most of you are done typing, and I realize if you're not, but I want you to look up on the screen, if you would, for a second. Does it make sense to people? It's as though I asked Valerie a question, and the question I ask her, whatever it is, the only answer she can give me is yes or no. Does that make sense? Okay? If she answers yes, I do this. If she answers no, I do this. Does that make sense? Because that's how an if statement works. The if asks, it's a Boolean condition, so it's a condition that must be true or false, yes or no, on or off, 1 or 0, however you look at it. If the condition is true, you do everything in the if body. That's everything in between the curly braces. If the if is false, you do everything within the else. But you must do one or the other. But you can only do one or the other. Does all that make sense? Does anybody still need this stuff? All right. Is that enough? Or do you need it higher? Okay. Because the else is very small. There's just a comment there and a single line of code. All right? But it's very important from the get-go that you understand that's how an if works. So again, if you're at all confused, because that's what I've been trying to lay out for you. And I've been teaching people how to program for years, and again, some people make it so much harder than it has to be. But again, if you say if, followed by some kind of condition. So if that condition is true, you'll do whatever's in here. Else, and that is if the condition is false. Then you end up doing whatever's in there. But if you run this code, you either must do this or you must do that. You must do one or the other, but you can only do one or the other. It's not possible for the computer to have a question that gets answered both yes and no. It doesn't make sense. The rest of the program is the same. So if you do put all that stuff in, you can try to run it and see if it runs. If you think you put in everything correctly, but it's not running for whatever reason, raise your hand and I'll try to work with you on it. We'll see if we can get it working. What I'll do at the end of the period, just like I did before, is I will send you this one. All right. In fact, I'm going to send you all 4 of them, both with, all actually embedded in the HTML and then not embedded in the HTML. Okay? And if you get it to work, I'm hoping everybody has this in about 10 minutes or so, and we'll take another break for 15 minutes. Yes. code right in that file itself, you don't need that stuff anymore. You don't need, yeah. You don't need any of that. Now, again, if it doesn't run, I'm not sure exactly how that works through, brackets, but you might want to try to run it.
No, the other day, what
Okay,
we do is,
well, yeah, I'd say, yeah, you can start looking through there, but if you look at it all and it appears to look okay, all right, like I said, by the end of the period today, I'm gonna send you working copies of it. Well, one thing is, see your prompting for this stuff, okay? Now you're trying to manipulate it before you've even prompted for the values. So this if and this else should go down there. That's the first thing. I have no idea if that's gonna fix any problem you're having, but you have to move it. Does that make sense as to why that would be?
Yeah.
But again, I don't know enough about brackets, so if it's not running under brackets, I can't tell you why. Hopefully it does. Well, the good news is you were able to print all that stuff in, all print. So I would go in and I would look at any code where you're doing, we'll go back up and see something. Maybe that was in the comment. So we'll go back down in your code, equal keep and stop. Okay, so gross pay, we changed it to hourly rate. See, that's kind of changed from pay rate to hourly to 50%. The names have got to be the same. So whatever you call the names up there, HRS work, pay rate, those are the names you're going to use in here. So change that over to pay rate. Because the way jobs. Right. And the reason, and I should have done a better job of using the same names, but the reason that that happened, that where you've got that else right there, underneath the else, you've got a line of code, you see what I'm talking about? Yeah. You got that same line twice, get rid of the second one. Now I see it. But you gotta go and make sure you use the same names all the time. Because the way most programming languages work, if you did that, the program would blow up. But JavaScript actually creates a brand new variable right there for you. Even though you gave it, because you gave it another name, so it creates a new variable and it gives the value of 0. So it doesn't know how to handle it. Okay? And what happens when you click run? Nothing?
If I run it on here, it's not gonna do it. But if I run it on this, which is what I have it linked to, then it just says
Okay, then the chances are pretty good if that happened. Look through and make sure, go back up to I'm sorry, the top there. Make sure that the names that are in here are exactly the same names you used throughout. If you deviate even once, that can screw it up. So that's the first thing to look at when you're starting to debug. Code comes up. Okay, so you don't run the JS. You got to go back to the HTML file. All right, did you link to the JS in there? See, I want to make sure, if everybody look up on the screen here, I want to make sure that you get this. All right, it's a very important topic. Right now, I have this in its own .js file. All right, you can't run a JS file from here. Notice what happens when I run it. It just shows the code because that's not an executable file. All right, so that's why I got that error. And if you run it and you get code, that's typically why and what's going to happen. On the other hand, now if I go back to the associated HTML file, all right, you've got to put that in there where you link to that file. Now you don't necessarily even need a button like this. It may work without the button, but you may need the button. But you must link to the JavaScript file. You have to do that. That's just the way that it works. I can't put it to you any other way, but you have to do that. It's the HTML file that you always want to run in the browser. The browser cannot try to come in and actually execute. It can't come in and actually try to execute JavaScript code. All right. You what? Answer's wrong. No, you read 50 over to 50. Yeah, I'd say it's wrong. Well, then let's go back and look at your calculation. First, let's look at the names of your variables. All right. So you got to make sure you're using HRS work and pay rate. But see, now you've got regular hours and, okay, that's fine. So go back down here. So that's HRS and pay rate. So that looks good. See, here you got hourly rate. You don't have hours worked. See that? So that's going to go for that out. Whatever you called it up here. So that's going to have to be HRS worked. And that'll be pay rate, and that'll be HRS work. It doesn't matter which one you put first, but you've got to use these names from up here. So put that in, change that, save it, and try to run it again to see if that fixed it. I'd say the first thing to do would be to go back and again check every single place in here where you're using any of those variables. And hourly rate there, but notice it's pay rate here. See what I'm saying? So you've got to go back and make sure that you're using the same variables all the time.
I just needed a button.
You what?
I just needed a button.
Okay.
Otherwise I wouldn't do anything.
Yeah, if any of you tried to put the JavaScript in an external file and it didn't work when you ran it, try putting the button in like I've got up on the screen right now and see if you can get it to work that way. All right. Yet it's not my goal here to screw people up and have people already think, I can't do this. I've had people who've told me, I can't do this, and they're now professional programmers. My litmus test is if I can do it, you sure as heck should be able to do it. again, if you're working on this and you call the thing pay rate in one place in the program and you called it rate in another place in the program, that can keep it from running. So names have to be the same, and this is a case-sensitive language. So if you call something pay rate, little p-a-y, big R, little a-t-e, you've got to always maintain the same thing. One thing I'm gonna be a stickler on this, and you've been warned already, is there's a way that you're supposed to write and create variables and name things. If you don't abide by that, I'm going to take off. All right, as the saying goes, it's not a threat, it's a promise. All right. Again, if you've gotten everything to work, or you're at the point where you think maybe it doesn't work, but you think you've got everything incorrect, please get another break, and at 10:30 I'm going to start up again, okay?
Not getting the right value.
Okay. From the top here.
I thought it would come up.
Where's work pay rate? Where's worked?
Let's go straight.
Where's pay rate? Where's worked? Looks like what you've got in here. Looks like it's
Yeah.
correct.
That's what I thought.
Okay, you don't, this is an extraneous line.
Okay.
So take this,
So-
let's take this line and comment it out. All right? And then save it and run it Go ahead and do it right here. Just save it and try to run it again. Because what you're doing is you're telling it to redo the pay rate. So if you had any overtime, it's redoing it as just straight time.
Okay.
So if you were putting in 50 and 10, you were getting 500.
Yep.
So it appears as if everything else you had in there was correct. Now, did we save? I didn't save it.
Oh. I didn't. Okay.
There you go.
Got it. Thank
Okay,
you.
you're welcome. Bless you. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College back at Rankin. So again, my display will be a little bit different. I'm going to be going over chapter 11 right now of Tony Gaddis's starting out with Java early on. Sir.
I've been having trouble getting the code to work.
Okay, I'll be right there.